In the Soviet Union, there was an organization whose name people dared not speak aloud. Not at home, not at work, not even among friends, because saying its name did not summon protection, it summoned fear. A knock at the door in the middle of the night often meant they had already come. The organization was called the NKVD, and once it noticed you, innocence no longer mattered. The NKVD did not appear suddenly. Its origins lie in the chaos that followed the Russian Revolution of 1917. When the Bolsheviks seized power, they inherited a shattered country. Civil war erupted almost immediately. Railways were sabotaged. Local officials were assassinated. Entire regions resisted the new regime. Vladimir Lenin believed the revolution would not survive without ruthless enforcement. In December 1917, the Bolsheviks created the Cheka, the Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. It was led by Felix Dzerzhinsky, a man who believed terror was not a regrettable necessity, but a moral duty. The Cheka had no legal restraints. It could arrest without warrants, imprison without trial, and execute without appeal. During the Russian Civil War, the Cheka carried out the Red Terror. Suspected enemies, former officials, landowners, priests, political rivals, were arrested en masse. Tens of thousands were executed. Many more simply disappeared. Fear became an organizing principle of the new state. When the Civil War ended, the terror did not. The Cheka was renamed the GPU, then the OGPU. But these changes were cosmetic. Its methods remained the same. Political repression was no longer a temporary emergency. It became permanent state policy. In 1934, under Joseph Stalin, the system was centralized. The People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs was created, the NKVD. For the first time, a single institution controlled ordinary policing, political surveillance, border security, prisons, internal troops, and the vast network of labor camps known as the Gulag. There were no checks and balances. Courts existed, but they were subordinate. Laws existed, but they were flexible. The NKVD answered directly to the Communist Party, and ultimately to Stalin himself. Files replaced evidence. Confessions replaced trials. Fear replaced law. Repression was no longer chaotic. It was organized. The first man to lead the NKVD was Genrikh Yagoda. Under Yagoda, the Gulag expanded at an unprecedented rate. Prisoners were transported in overcrowded railcars to remote regions, Siberia, the Arctic, Central Asia. They were forced to dig canals, fell forests, mine coal and gold, and construct railways under brutal conditions. Food was scarce, clothing was inadequate, disease was rampant. Survival depended on meeting labor quotas. But forced labor was not enough for Stalin. He demanded absolute loyalty and visible enemies. In 1936, Yagoda was arrested, accused of conspiracy and treason, and executed. His replacement would take repression to a level that shocked even hardened party officials. When Nikolai Yezhov became head of the NKVD in 1936, a dark new chapter opened in Soviet history. This period became known as the Great Terror. Across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, arrest orders flooded in from Moscow. Local NKVD offices were handed quotas, numerical targets for arrests and executions. It was a macabre production line with human lives as the raw material. Interrogations were brutal and systematic. The goal wasn't to discover the truth, but to manufacture confessions. Prisoners were beaten mercilessly, deprived of sleep for days on end, and psychologically broken with threats against their families. Under this unbearable pressure, they confessed to crimes they never committed. These confessions were then rewritten by interrogators and signed by the victims. Trials, when they happened at all, were a sham. Lasting mere minutes, they were just a formality to rubber stamp a predetermined verdict. Guilt was assumed from the moment of arrest. Between 1936 and 1938, the scale of this terror was staggering. Roughly 1.5 million people were arrested. Hundreds of thousands were executed, often with a single bullet to the back of the head. Millions more were sentenced to the Gulag, the vast network of Soviet labor camps. Fear paralyzed entire communities. No one knew who would be next. And then, in a grim twist of fate, the system consumed its own architect. In 1939, Nikolai Yezhov himself was arrested. The man who had overseen the Great Terror was now subjected to its methods. He was interrogated, tortured, and ultimately executed in secret, becoming just another name on the long list of victims he had created. After Yezhov, Stalin's final and most powerful security chief took charge, Lavrentiy Beria. Beria didn't end the repression. He refined it. He dialed back the random, chaotic nature of the mass arrests, but he made the system far more efficient and bureaucratic. The NKVD evolved into a more professional, more sophisticated organization of control. Surveillance became all-encompassing. Intelligence operations, both at home and abroad, grew more complex. During World War II, the NKVD under Beria carried out one of the most brutal acts of state-sponsored violence, the forced deportation of entire ethnic groups. Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, and many others were accused of disloyalty. Families were given only minutes to pack their belongings before being herded onto cattle cars and shipped thousands of miles to Central Asia and Siberia. Hundreds of thousands died from disease, starvation, and exposure during the journey or in the harsh conditions of exile. Beria's NKVD also played a crucial role in the Cold War's origins. It orchestrated a massive espionage operation targeting Western atomic research programs. By infiltrating projects like the Manhattan Project, Soviet spies accelerated the USSR's development of its own nuclear weapons, forever changing the global balance of power. But Beria's ambition was his undoing. After Stalin's death in 1953, he made a bid to seize total control of the state. His rivals in the Kremlin, fearing his power, moved against him. Beria was arrested, tried in secret, and executed, just like so many of his own victims. The NKVD's influence reached far beyond arrests and executions. It fundamentally transformed the fabric of daily life in the Soviet Union. Millions of ordinary citizens were recruited, or more often coerced, into a vast network of informants. People filed reports on their co-workers, their neighbors, their classmates, and even their own family members. The motives were complex, a toxic mix of fear, ideological zeal, personal ambition, or petty revenge. No space was private, no conversation was safe. People learned to measure every single word, knowing that an offhand comment could lead to a late-night knock on the door. Silence became a primary form of self-defense. While the Soviet Union had laws and legal procedures on the books, they were largely irrelevant. Arrests almost always came in the dead of night. The charges were intentionally vague: anti-Soviet activity, counter-revolutionary intent. Evidence wasn't required because in the paranoid world of the NKVD, innocence was not a defense. Through the Gulag system, the NKVD also became a massive economic engine. It controlled a slave labor force of millions. Entire regions of the country, particularly in the frozen wastelands of Siberia, were developed through the brutal exploitation of prisoners. Railroads, canals, and even entire cities were built on the backs of people who were often given no idea how long their sentences would last. The Soviet Union industrialized at a breathtaking pace, but this progress was paid for with the lives and freedom of its own citizens. Fear was weaponized as a tool of productivity. After World War II, the Soviet security apparatus began to change. In 1946, the NKVD was rebranded as the Ministry of Internal Affairs, or MVD. Its state security functions were separated out into a new organization. Then, following Stalin's death and Beria's execution, the new Soviet leadership tried to distance themselves from the blatant brutality of the terror era, but without giving up their grip on power. So, in 1954, a new organization was created, the Committee for State Security, the KGB. The name changed and the structure evolved. Repression became less overt, more legalistic, and more discreet. The midnight arrests and mass executions were replaced with more subtle forms of control: psychiatric abuse, internal exile, and constant surveillance. But the foundations of the system, laid by the NKVD, remained firmly in place. Today, the NKVD no longer exists as an organization, but its legacy is undeniable. It proved that fear could be bureaucratized, that repression could be systematized on an industrial scale, and that silence could be enforced across an entire society. The KGB inherited that system and carried its dark legacy through the Cold War. To truly understand the Soviet Union, its power, its paranoia, and its paradoxes, you have to understand the NKVD. Because it didn't just enforce the system. For a long and terrible time, it was the system. Thanks for watching. If you found this history insightful, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into the forces that have shaped our world.